Well, good morning and welcome, Epilos Talmudim, and any visitors watching this online. Greetings from Epilos NTCG. Bringing you teaching today on Sunday, the 4th of February 2024. And our teaching comes from the Yitro Torah portion, which covers Exodus chapter 18, verse 1 through to chapter 20 and verse 23. The title of the Torah portion derives from the first verse of the reading, which says, "Now Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people." Exodus 18 and verse 1. And the Torah portion relates the story of Jethro's visit to the camp of Israel, and then tells of the great event of God revealing himself at Mount Sinai, where God gives Israel the 10 commandments and invites the people to enter a special covenant relationship with him. It's that special covenant relationship that I'll be speaking about today. And so our teaching is called the marriage at Mount Sinai. The marriage at Mount Sinai. We'll begin with Moses' testimony to his father-in-law of God's goodness. Exodus chapter 18, verse 8 to 9 reads like this. Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had befallen them on the journey, and how the Lord had delivered them. Jethro rejoiced over all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel in delivering them from the hand of the Egyptians. So when Moses and the children of Israel went out from Egypt, the news of the event of their departure reached Moses' family in Midian. His father-in-law Jethro set out to meet Moses and the host of Israel in the wilderness. Moses told Jethro everything that had happened to them, how the Lord had delivered them again and again. Then Jethro rejoiced and declared in chapter 18 and verse 11, "Now I know that the Lord," capital L-O-R-D, that is Yod-He Vav-He, "now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods." Prior to that moment, Jethro had not been a believer in Yod-He Vav-He, the Lord. He was a pagan priest. The testimony of Moses changed his life. He forsook other gods and turned to the one true living God. And such is the power of testimony, telling how God changed your life. Now, we all have stories about what God has done for us, how he has transformed us, rescued us, and delivered us. Our personal stories of encounters with the living God can be a powerful tool in bringing others into the kingdom. And as we reach out into the world, we should be ready to share our stories with those who are still searching for God and meaning to life. Moses was ready to tell his story to his father-in-law. And as we look towards the task of bringing others into the kingdom, our families is a good place to start. Tell them of the goodness of God towards you. Testimony is powerful. Of course, it is anecdotal, it is subjective, but in the great endeavor of evangelism, it is the most powerful tool that we have. After all, faith in God is not reached or attained through rational and dispassionate argumentation. Our faith in God is relational. It's about a relationship. And the only way of conveying a sense of personal relationship is by telling about our own subjective experience. You can't argue someone into a relationship with persuasive words or tricky sound bites. But by telling your story, you can say, look, this is how I know God, or this is how I have experienced him, or this is what he has done for me. Tell your story. When I came to faith in King Messiah, I had a dramatic encounter with God. And at that point, I pledged my allegiance to his son, Yeshua of Nazareth. Now, I also had the benefit of having godly parents. And some people who grow up in faith-based homes with godly parents feel that because they do not have a dramatic conversion story, that their testimony will be somehow less effective in drawing others to the Lord. That's not true. That's not true. You can still say, I grew up in a religious home. I always had a sense of the presence of God. I was blessed to be raised by godly parents, but I didn't take God for granted. You can tell them about how God pursued you. You can say, let me tell you about how or when I got serious with God. This is what happened. Something like that. Every disciple has a story to tell. So tell yours. Exodus 19 and verse 5 reads like this. Now then, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for the earth is mine. Previously, God had said to the children of Israel in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 7, he said, I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. Now, if you explore some good Bible commentaries on this passage, you would discover that this phrase was an adaptation of an expression from the sphere of marriage or adoption. In the ancient Near East, the wedding formulation was, you will be my wife, I will be your husband. And in the Hebrew Bible, it is common to speak of marriage as taking a wife. So in this way, God likened himself to a suitor of the people of Israel, and the people of Israel to the young woman that he, God, was courting. He did not simply want to redeem them from slavery. He was not content to just do that. He wanted to take them as his very own people and enjoy an intimate relationship with them like that of a husband to a wife. Now this is covenantal language. God wanted to enter into a covenant with Israel. Now, a covenant is a contractual arrangement that specifies the terms and conditions of a relationship. The marriage metaphor is a good way to understand the covenant at Mount Sinai. The sages of Israel speak of Exodus chapter 19 as God's betrothal of Israel. Consequently, then, at the foot of Mount Sinai, God officially asked for Israel's hand in marriage. He spoke to her lovingly. He reminded the people of how he had carried them out of Egypt as if on the wings of eagles, and how he had brought them to himself. And he promised to make them his own special treasure above all the other peoples. He said, Exodus 19 and verse 5, you shall be my own possession. The interesting word that's used there, because the Hebrew word that the NASB translation that we used here at Epinos, the word translated as possession is the word segula. Segula, for those of you who use Strong's Concordance to dig things out, I encourage that. It's reference 7320. Now, the word segula means possession in the NASB, but some versions translate it as beloved treasure or peculiar treasure. In the Near Ancient East, the term segula was also used to describe a king's prized possession, prized trophy. When a king's army vanquished an enemy, the king kept the most valuable items for his own treasure. A precious object like this was called a segula. And in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 5, the word is used as a term of endearment for Israel. God says that he will make the Israelites into his specially prized treasure. He says that even though he owns the entire earth, Israel will always be his own special people. And that's significant in our times, in the world today. Now we can compare this relationship to that of a king who had conquered many lands and possessed great wealth. His treasures were filled with valuables, But he had one precious gemstone that he valued above all others. And rather than leave it in the treasury with all of the other valuables, he hung it on a gold chain and wore it around his neck every day. That's the way God looks at Israel and each of us. Every person who turns to God in faith and love is added to his special treasure, is added to his holy people. Let's go on. Let's go further. Exodus 19, verses 10 to 11. The Lord also said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, that's capital Lord, will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." Before a traditional Jewish wedding, it's customary for the bride and the groom to immerse themselves in a baptism. It's a purity ritual. Both bride and groom want to be ritually pure on their wedding night. In Hebrew, you may recall that a gathering of water suitable for ritual immersion is called a mikveh. Now, a mikveh may be a river, a lake, or any naturally fed pool of water. In the Torah, the ritual of baptizing oneself in a mikveh is sometimes referred to as washing one's garments. Like a bride preparing for her wedding day, the people of Israel washed their garments. They purified themselves before meeting with God at Mount Sinai. Exodus 19 and verse 12. You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, beware that you do not go up on the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. As God prepared to descend upon Mount Sinai, he was concerned about the safety of the people. He warned them twice not to come too close to the mountain, to touch it, or try to ascend it. The warning seems harsh. Anyone who touched the mountain was to be put to death. Why would a loving God make such a harsh rule? Well, the concern was a matter of holiness, God's holiness. God is dangerous in much the same way that lightning is dangerous. It is awe-inspiring and beautiful to observe and to watch, but if you get too close to lightning, it's deadly. Now, in the biblical world, there is an understood axiom and an accepted truth that no man can see God and live. God's presence can be lethal. Now, we developed our understanding of this in our teachings on the tabernacle and the sacrifices. Mortal flesh cannot endure the manifest glory of the living God. And in order then for God to descend on Mount Sinai, the mountain itself needed to be made holy, to be made separate. People going up to the mountain, touching it, or ascending on it would violate the holiness, the separateness of the mountain. Therefore, the boundaries and the limits that defined the holy space at Mount Sinai were a necessary precaution, not only to protect the sanctity of the mountain, the holy precinct itself, you might want to say, but also to protect the people from the consuming and devastating presence of God. You might recall that Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 29 tells us, our God is a consuming fire. And so by making the penalty for violating the boundary a death sentence, God communicated the gravity of the danger to the people. Now, the holiness of God is not well understood in today's world, or even in many churches and congregations. The modern assessment of God usually does not depict God as being dangerous and unapproachable, and that's unfortunate. Because it's only when we understand how unapproachable God is that we can appreciate the value of being able to approach him in the name of Yeshua. The wonderful hymn, one of my favorite hymns, Immortal, Invisible, seeks to convey this concept. Immortal, invisible, God only wise, in light inaccessible, hid from our eyes. Notice that phrase, in light inaccessible. Can't reach him. Too intense. Dangerous. And I remind you that the one that we are speaking of today is the one spoken of in the book of Revelation, where it is said that at the time of the great white throne judgment, the earth and the heavens fled from his presence. God's presence is dangerous. Dangerous. This can be compared to a king who sat on a throne. Anyone who approached the king first without first being summoned was sentenced to death. You know that happened in biblical times. But in this comparison, his son could approach his father, the king, whenever he wanted, and he often brought his friends into the king's presence as well. And so the prince's friends became familiar with the king. When they were reminded of the law against approaching him unbidden, they said, "That sounds too harsh. Surely the king is not so harsh." Then the king had to remind them, "You have known me as a father only because you are beloved on account of my son. Do not forget that I am also a king." Yeah. Exodus chapter 19 and verse 17. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Interestingly, in a traditional Jewish wedding, the bride and groom are married beneath a canopy called a chuppah. Chuppah, that's C-H-U-P-P-A-H. The word is used in several places in the Bible. For example, the prophet Joel says, "Let the bridegroom come out of his room and the bride out of her chuppah." That's Joel chapter 2 and verse 16. And similarly, Psalm 19 and verse 5 also speaks of the bridegroom coming out of his chuppah. The chuppah is a symbol of the new house being formed by the union of the bride and groom. Now, we may ask the question, was there a chuppah at Mount Sinai? The cloud of glory that was over the mountain can be compared to a chuppah. And a similar image appears in the prophecies of Isaiah. Isaiah says that in the Messianic age, God will spread a canopy of cloud over Jerusalem. Isaiah chapter 4 and verse 5 reads like this: "Then the Lord, Yod-He, Vav-He, capital L-O-R-D, will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory will be a chuppah," a canopy. And indeed, as we look at the scriptures, and from a Hebraic Jewish perspective, Mount Sinai itself is sometimes likened to a chuppah. Exodus chapter 19 and verse 17 says that the people stood beneath the mountain. This can be compared to a bride standing beneath the bridal canopy of the chuppah. Now, of course, one cannot take the statement literally in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 17, but it is intended to cement the image of the wedding at Mount Sinai in our minds. Exodus chapter 19 and verse 20. "The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up." You may be very familiar with this text. God descended onto Mount Sinai in the midst of smoke, lightning, and a fanfare of trumpet blasts. The mountain trembled before him. The writer of the book of Hebrews described it as a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and whirlwind. That's Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 18. And then verse 21 of the same chapter tells us, so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. What happened at Mount Sinai was the great entrance of the groom into the chuppah. Now, in a traditional Jewish wedding, a marriage contract is read aloud to the bride and groom as part of the covenant ceremony. And this written contract is called the ketubah. The ketubah spells out the terms and conditions which are incumbent upon the man and the woman. And after the ceremony, witnesses sign the ketubah. In Jewish tradition, the ketubah is displayed in the home as evidence that the marriage is legal. As we read the scriptures today, in the wedding at Mount Sinai, the Torah is the ketubah. The Torah is the legally binding covenant contract between God and his bride, Israel. From the top of Mount Sinai that day, God spoke the 10 commandments to all of Israel. And this can be compared to the reading of the ketubah in a wedding ceremony. Then later on, you'll find Moses reading the book of the covenant to the assembly in Israel. That's in Exodus chapter 24, from verse 4, and particularly verse 7. Now, what we're describing is now a different way of looking at the commandments of the Torah. We should not think, as many do, we should not think of them as rules imposed by some impersonal government. No. The commandments of the Torah are more like the wedding vows joyously taken by a blushing bride on her wedding day. Now, if we understand the Torah as a ketubah, that is the contract of a marriage covenant, then we see that it is far more than an ethical system or a moral list of do's and don'ts. Instead, it functions as the sacred marriage covenant between God and his people. It lays out the parameters for the relationship, and it also outlines the expectations. Its specific instructions and stipulations are designed to make the marriage happy, fruitful, and functional. It defines obligations of both the husband and the wife and describes how they are to treat each other. And so, therefore now, to violate the ketubah is to violate the marriage. You may note then that in keeping with this marital and marriage metaphor, the prophets often charged the nation of Israel with marital unfaithfulness whenever they violated the Torah. Like ancient marriage counselors, the prophets rebuked the people in order to return them to their covenant vows. Now, this marriage metaphor better enables us to understand the magnificent 10 commandments and the other 603 that follow. They are simply the terms of a most wondrous wedding, the terms of the marriage at Mount Sinai. And in closing, let me add that since we know that God isn't into divorce, we can correctly state that he is still married to Israel. And the Torah, the written contract, the ketubah, is still in place and remains valid. Yes, it is. Therefore, anyone saying that the Torah has been abolished is in effect saying that God's marriage to Israel has ended and that God, who hates divorce, has divorced them. Heaven forbid. God's relationship with Israel is more than a metaphor. He remains to this day in covenant with Israel. Unlike many marriages today, the marriage at Mount Sinai is still lasting. And the ketubah still has pride of place in the marital home, which means that the Torah is still in effect. Think about it. Think about it. If God's marriage to Israel is over and he has divorced them because of their failure to keep the covenant, he can just as well do the same to all of us as followers of Yeshua. But he hasn't done that to Israel because he's faithful to them. And since he's faithful to Israel, we can rely on him being faithful to us too. That's the reason we can confidently sing songs like, "Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee." Have you ever looked into that phrase? There is no shadow of turning. It actually means that there isn't even a hint of God changing his mind. There isn't even a hint of a chance that God will change his mind and become unfaithful to Israel. And if that is true, and it is, that's good news indeed. So then, the awe-inspiring occasion of the marriage at Mount Sinai and the enduring permanence of God's marriage contract, the wonderful ketubah called the Torah, is a glorious reminder of God's faithfulness. And for that, we can all be grateful and thankful. Amen. May God bless you all, and I trust this enables you now to look and to view the Torah, the commandments, the law, given by God to Israel at Mount Sinai through new eyes. For yes, what took place at Mount Sinai was a marriage. The marriage at Mount Sinai. May God bless you as you reflect on these things. Amen.